Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 12th of September and this is the Full Scottish. I'm Andrew Wilson and today I'm presenting the programme from our studios in Cowcaddens. First, we will look briefly at today's coronavirus update. Then I will introduce our two guests for this afternoon's programme, and then together we will discuss the stories behind this week's news headlines. As at 2 p.m. yesterday, there were 4,298 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. There have been 10 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive for COVID. 4,137,710 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,769,320 have received their second dose. 985 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID, 83 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 498,745 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID-19, and in total 8,242 patients who tested positive have sadly died. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this afternoon by two fantastic guests who will be discussing this week's news headlines with me. Firstly, we're joined from Straven by Linda Fabiani. Linda served in our Parliament from 1999 until the election in May earlier this year, when she perhaps earned time off for good behaviour. She was a list MSP and then became the MSP for East Kilbride, and in the last Parliament she was one of the Deputy Presiding Officers. Linda, good afternoon, how are you?
I'm absolutely grand, thank you, Andrew. Hello everyone.
It's great to see you, Linda. Thank you for joining us today on the Full Scottish. And also we're joined today by Paul McLennan MSP. Paul has been the MSP for East Lothian since the election in May. Previously he was a councillor in Dunbar and East Lothian. And Paul is the first SNP MSP for East Lothian. Paul, good afternoon. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm not bad, thank you. Good to be on.
It's fantastic for you to join us. It's great to see you both. And we're very grateful to you for joining us. So the first topic we're going to discuss today relates to the announcements of the vaccination certification plans. Towards the end of this last week, the Scottish Parliament approved the use of coronavirus vaccination certificates to enter some events and higher risk venues. Humza Yousaf, the Health Secretary, said it will only be used in certain higher risk settings, and we hope this will allow businesses to remain open and prevent any further restrictions as we head into autumn and winter. We want to ensure that as many people get vaccinated as possible, and particularly to increase the uptake in the younger age cohort, so anything that helps to incentivise this is helpful. Now, the new scheme is not being introduced until all Scottish adults have had the opportunity to receive both doses of the vaccine, plus 2 weeks have passed to allow the vaccine to take effect. And from the 30th of September, people will be able to use the NHS Scotland COVID status app, which has a QR code on it to access venues where certification is required. And anyone who is unable to use who's unable or unwilling to use the app can request a secure, uneditable paper record of their vaccination status. Now, there was some political controversy in the Parliament this week relating to the proposal which was ultimately passed to introduce vaccine certificates for Scotland. And then, of course, this morning, the English Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, has told the BBC that the English plans, which had been the proposals which had been brought forward to introduce vaccine certification for England, that those will now not be introduced, and England will not move to a vaccination programme. So firstly, coming to you, Linda, what's your reaction to the news of the likely introduction of vaccine certificates for people in Scotland in certain settings from the end of this month?
Yeah, I mean, there's something, it naturally goes against the grain for many of us to have any kind of what we see as ID or, any separation of people. However, we're in an unprecedented situation here, so I can completely understand why those who have to look after and are charged with looking after public safety feel that this is necessary. So I'm actually okay with it. I would like to think that it will be regularly monitored, and that there are opportunities that maybe Paul will talk about, having heard the debate and stuff, further down the line for removing this restriction, at regular intervals. This morning's announcement by the English Health Secretary, I found quite stunning. I mean, they've been all over the place in this. I mean, first of all, they were talking about them, then there was definitely no vaccine passports, then maybe there would be, then they announced it, and now they've changed their mind. I'll be interested to see, that the schools in England have just gone back. I'll be interested to see whether they have another peak, same as we've had here, which is now hooking downwards. So I'll be interested to see the debate down south if it starts to rise again. But I think one thing, or two things actually for sure, people like certainty. People get very, very concerned when those that are supposed to be in charge are all over the place and don't have a definitive position. And I think one thing that Nicola Sturgeon and our government have always shown is that they take careful decisions, they don't rush into them, they don't throw them out there and then change their mind. They take a decision and they stick with it. And I have confidence that the decision taken by the Scottish Government is one which is deemed to be the best for Scotland. And, it'd be interesting to see how all this pans out. I'm a wee bit worried about the Transmit Festival over the weekend in Glasgow, which seems to be going very, very well. But that's the first really big event in over 3 days. So I'm a wee bit worried about what some of the outcomes of that might be, but we have to wait and see.
Thanks, Linda. We should bring to your attention. We should also discuss. We've been monitoring the rolling 14-day average of new COVID cases here on Broadcasting Scotland, and the graph that you can see on your screen now shows that for the first time since we entered level 0 in Scotland, the rolling 14-day average of new cases appears to have peaked, and over the last 2 or 3 days, the number of new cases has started to drop on a 14-day rolling average. And so, Linda, your point that you make with regard to what may happen in terms of the new case levels in England and Wales with the recent return to school and recent large events in England and Wales, do you think there's a chance that we will see that England has a little while longer to go before it reaches a possible peak in the rate of infection?
Well, obviously, I would hope not. You don't want anywhere to be getting increases in infection. But when you look at what happened when the schools went back here, and we go back so much sooner, what was it, 3 weeks, I think?
Mm-hmm.
It would be surprising if there is not an effect in England and Wales by the same thing.
Thanks, Linda. Now, Paul, as an MSP, you were likely at Parliament when the vaccine certification programme was being debated this week. And so it'd be interesting to listen to your reflections on the politicking that was associated with the discussion and the way in which the parties apparently broke on the opposition, the voting on the proposal broke strictly along party lines.
Yeah, it was interesting, Andrew. I actually spoke in the debate, and it's probably, I've been there 4 months, and it was probably the most fractious debate that I've been involved in since being elected. And there was a lot of heckling, I have to say, going on at the time, and it is a very fractious debate, and it did split along party lines. And up until this morning, the Tories were going to back it down south, and I think Linda made the very interesting point. They've changed their mind around about 6 or 7 times on this, and I wouldn't be surprised if they change it back yet again. Keir Starmer in the debate down south also talked around about Labour Party's position, that they supported it, also along with other measures such as testing and test and protect and so on. So yeah, it did kind of split along these lines. And yeah, but I like Linda, I'm convinced that this is the best way to try and tackle about where we are in the pandemic at the moment. It's not the only measure. Obviously, we've got to look at test and protect. We're doing very well on vaccinations, and we continue to push that as well. And I know in my own area and other areas, there are many opportunities now just for walk-in vaccines and so on. So it's one of the sweet measures, and I agree with Linda. It's not something intuitively that it's something you would want to see people being restricted to going from. But we're in a pandemic, we are in unprecedented times, and I think this is the correct thing to do at this time in the pandemic. And it's reviewed every 3 weeks, which I think is really important. And we continue to see where the situation is. and there, and I was at a briefing just on Friday from NHS Lothian, and obviously they're talking about the pressures that are now coming through to the hospitals, and I think I said in a debate last week, the government's first duty is to protect its citizens, and I think by bringing in the passport, it is doing that. You know, that suite of measures that's there. So yeah, I would agree that it's the correct thing to do at this stage.
That's a good point that you make, Paul. And also, I'm going to quote Hamza Yusuf again, if I may. Separately, he was pointing out that now the second dose of the vaccination has been offered to all eligible adults in Scotland. He said that today is a significant day because every single adult in Scotland has now been given the opportunity to be fully vaccinated against COVID, and he wanted to pass on his thanks to all of those who helped to make this possible, from the scientists who developed the vaccine to the hard-working staff delivering the programme on the ground. He also wanted to thank everyone who has taken up the offer of a vaccine and rolled up their sleeves to help tackle the coronavirus. He said, to all those who haven't yet had their second doses, please don't leave the job half done. Even if the time since the first dose is more than 8 weeks, people can still be vaccinated, and I encourage them to come forward. Students heading to university or college from anywhere in the UK or abroad are reminded they too are urged to take up this offer if it's relevant to them. Indeed, in addition to drop-in clinics around the country, mobile vaccination units are visiting several further education campuses. So, Paul, thinking of the point that was made with regard to incentivising those who have not yet had their second doses in particular, do you think that requiring vaccination certificates for entering certain nightclubs and certain other public events, do you think that will encourage those who haven't had their second dose to take up the offer?
Yeah, I think very much so. I think, you know, the health secretary mentioned that, cabinet secretary mentioned that last week in the debate, and there are, you know, around about the uptake increasing by up to 50% last week in the younger age group, the 18 to 29 age group last weekend, just in last weekend alone, and you know, hopefully we'll see that this weekend as well. It'll be interesting to see what the figures are. But there's also international precedences in that as well. In France and in Israel, for example, when they mentioned similar kind of schemes that coming in, they've seen a big spike in people taking the vaccine as well. So, and you know, certainly from that point of view, you know, one of the things that Anna Sarwar had mentioned, you know, even before it was debated, was around about it might increase vaccine hesitancy. I can't agree with that, and you know, I think, you know, what we've seen so far in Scotland and what we've seen in other countries, I think it will you know, increase the number of people, particularly in the younger age group, the 18 to 29, that we're talking about possibly that we're going to transmit, for example, this weekend. You know, taking up the offer of the vaccine.
Of course. Thanks, Paul. We'll change gear now, and we'll move on to our next story that we'll discuss. And of course, yesterday was the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in the United States. I think we all have our own recollections of standing, usually with others, watching those catastrophic events unfold 20 years ago. Certainly the museum at Ground Zero in Manhattan, I think, is one of the most affecting and one of the most moving buildings I've ever been in. And so, firstly, Linda, I was going to ask you, do you have any reflections yourself on the events that unfolded 20 years and one day ago in the US?
Oh gosh. I mean, it's one of these times where everybody knows where they were when they heard about it. I was in Parliament at that time, up at the top of the mound. It was before we moved down to the current Parliament building. And I remember being in a meeting and someone coming in and saying, there's a plane, you know, just crashed into the World Trade Centre. And there was that thought that it was maybe a wee glider or something, and you know, some poor soul had got it terribly wrong. But then going through and seeing events unfold, and I remember particularly myself and Trisha Marwick, sitting, we were all in a state of shock watching all this unfold. And of course, all the speculation was going on about who was responsible. And one thing I absolutely remember is the speed with which these buildings collapsed, and been absolutely stunned and aghast at how this had happened so quickly. And of course, we had all sorts of inquiries and things after that, but it was such an awful time. Reflections on it. I think there was a big shock for all of us here in the West. It was such a big event, and whilst there's horrendous deaths all over the world in all different countries and always have been, and they affect you and you hear about them, there's something different when it's not just on your doorstep, but within your own part of the world and the part of the world that you sort of relate to most. So it was a real shock, and also that feeling of sort of the invincibility of the USA, um, the strength of it, and here it had happened in their soil. And of course, everything that happened after that, oh my goodness, it would take hours to discuss all of that. You know, the axis of terror and the war of terrorism, all the results that have come from that and still playing out today. We discussed last time I was on the programme, we discussed Afghanistan. So, reflections for me would be sadness. I mean, I sat last night and I found it on Twitter and I watched Paul Simon singing Sounds of Silence at the venue. And yeah, tears, sadness, still that sense of shock. The work that was done here in Scotland, in Glasgow, the caring city. I don't know for listeners that heard the Reverend Galbraith on the radio yesterday, talking about the work that was done by Glasgow, the caring city, in bringing families who'd lost people over to Scotland to try and get a different place to be for a wee while, to make new friends, know that people across the world were reaching out to them. They did very good work, and I was privileged and honoured to attend some events. The firefighters here in Scotland who helped their colleagues in New York in all sorts of ways. My goodness, loads of reflection. But you know, violence continues, violence of all sorts, whether it's state sponsored, whether it's what we call terrorism, whether it's individuals who take things into their own hands for all sorts of reasons. It's a difficult world to be in. That's my reflection.
Absolutely. Thank you, Linda. Thank you. Paul, Linda makes a number of interesting points, including the shock that so many people felt at the time, seeing what was the most powerful nation on the planet at that time under attack on its own soil, but also the ramifications and the ripple effect, if you will, that, over the past 20 years that we've seen. Paul, do you think that that either we in the West or our political leaders or those who are responsible to those to whom we delegate responsibility for keeping us safe, do you think we have learned anything over the past 20 years?
No, and you know, yeah, I think Afghanistan kind of brings everything back to reality about where that event happened 20 years ago, and obviously that was a prelude, if you like, into to the US invading Afghanistan and so on. And here we are 20 years later, and nothing much has been achieved, and we've still got areas of conflict all over the world. And you know, and I think there are still lessons to be learnt from that in terms of nation building. And I think that was one of the key things that was talked about when they, you know, particularly in Afghanistan, but not just that. I mean, obviously with Iraq and Syria and so on, and we still see, you know, major ramifications of foreign policy that's come through then. So, and I still think that'll continue to go on for a long number of years. And you know, and again, this maybe ties back. You know, I know we've talked about this previously. Andrew is talking around about, you know, what would a Scottish foreign policy look like, and what would be our impact in the world, sort of thing. But yeah, but there are still major ramifications, and there needs to be a much more deeper thought around about how we rebuild countries after these things happen. And but you know, the consequences are still there. And just to probably come back and on reflection of, you know, actually the event that day, I was working on a training course with the Bank of Scotland, and somebody came in and told us what had happened. And I think that whole afternoon we just watched it. And I've been fortunate enough, you know, to be across to New York 3 or 4 times, seen it just after Ground Zero, and obviously seen it once it was rebuilt. And like yourself, Andrew, been to the museum, which was incredibly moving. You know, and that'll stick with me the rest of my life. Actually, walking around a bit there that time, and you still feel that. It was a sad day. That I think, as Linda said, you'll remember where you were for the rest of your life.
Oh, absolutely, Paul. Thank you. And your point's right. It certainly struck me that that the museum at Ground Zero, it's the only museum I know where there are boxes of tissues round every corner. It's a very striking, a very moving building indeed. But we'll move on to discuss the next story today, if we may. And that's that overnight there is a new superstar has appeared in the sporting firmament. Emma Raducanu has blown everything and everybody away with her astonishing win at the US Open tennis. She is still. I've really been rather struck over the last few days with her appearance and the way in which she's made progress and then eventually won last night. I've really been quite struck by the position that the right-wing UK media have been taking, and I certainly was reminded of that by I think it was the Express on Thursday, who their front page, on the one half of the front page was the headline, "Migrants will be turned back to France," and the other half of the front page was a very joyful picture of Canadian-born with Chinese and Romanian parents, Emma Raducanu. So, Linda, firstly coming to you, what are your reflections either in terms of the sporting achievement of this incredible young woman, or also the difficulty that it may present some of the right-wing politicians and media with whom we are blessed in the UK?
Well, first of all, the sport, I didn't get to see it much as I would have liked to, but I didn't manage. But what an absolute star, that wee girl. I shouldn't call her a wee girl, I suppose, but she looks like a wee girl. See that wonderful, radiant smile when she won and everything about her. And the way she's conducted herself is just absolutely stunning. It's fabulous, and I'm so delighted for her. In fact, the young woman who was her opponent in the final as well, two absolute stars. My goodness, so young and so composed, and oh gosh, just fabulous. The bigger issue, where Emma comes from, my goodness, where to start? Our country's built on immigration. My own family, of course, I mean, that's my own name, Fabiani. My grandfather was Italian, came here, started a business with his brothers. Our country's built on that. It's built on people coming and choosing to make their home here, raising their families. And the vast majority of those who come are hard workers. That cannot be denied. Every single study that is done shows that migrants, whether they be asylum seekers, refugees, or even what has become a pejorative term, economic migrants, every single study has shown their net worth is positive for this country. And the whole Brexit thing put it into stark relief, because whilst we've been used to the right-wing press and right-wing politicians who stir it up, having a go at asylum seekers, having a go at refugees, the Brexit issue was the first time when those who had made their lives here 2 and 3 generations before, from other parts of Europe, and then became our partners in the European Union, all of a sudden we're being told, you might have contributed here for decades, your family might all have done very, very well, but do you know what? You need our permission to be here because you're not really part of us. And it was vile. It was awful. And the upset that caused was horrendous. So whether it be the upset caused to European citizens or whether it be the upset caused to those who come fleeing persecution, looking for a safe haven, or those who come to better the lot of themselves and their family, all of a sudden the UK became a very unwelcoming place. And it's a huge sadness to me that Scotland is part of that UK that is such an unwelcoming place. And if I ever needed any motivation for independence, which I haven't for my adult life, that would have given me it. And so I hope that, I hate the idea of saying that such a young person with so much ahead of her in life should become a figurehead for things. But I certainly hope it makes people think, not just about those who come and achieve greatness on behalf of the nation, but also those who work in the day-to-day running of Scotland, of England, of Wales, of the north of Ireland who work in the day-to-day running of it in the health service, in the hospitality industry, in the food industry. We're seeing the results of that with Brexit already. I hope it gives people pause for thought and a recognition, that we are, in fact, all the same, and that we're all just working generally for better lives for ourselves, for those we love, and for our wider society in general.
Thanks, Linda. That's a very good point that you make. I would certainly say that whether you're a new sporting star in the firmament or whether you're not, everybody achieves greatness in their own way as they can on a day-to-day basis as we all make our way through our lives. Paul, turning to you for a second on the first issue here, Emma Raducanu is it the case that she's the right kind of the right kind of migrant?
Yeah, Andrew, I think you're right. I mean, I think that it was covered off in the Express, but I also seen on Twitter this morning, there was a tweet from Nigel Farage, supporting her and welcoming her, and you're almost thinking, the pure hypocrisy, because he was also, he was asked a number of years ago around about would he be happy with a Romanian family living next door to him, and he said no, and then he has the cheek then to go on and praise her with obviously Romanian parents. So it's a right-wing press, it's right-wing politicians, as Linda said, and that is right. I mean, it's the right type of, in their eyes, it's the right type of immigrant, and it's it's sickening to see it. To be totally honest with you, it's the pure hypocrisy of that. And in terms of the sporting achievement, what she's done to get to that level at 18-year-old, the elite level at elite sports is absolutely fantastic achievement. So good luck to her. But I think, as Linda said as well, there are certainly major impacts that we're seeing on that right now. And I've got a question on Parliament Wednesday asking around about what are the sectorial shortages in terms of various areas in terms of Brexit. So we're seeing it right across the country. Whether it's the NFU in short farmers, whether it's the leisure the trade, whether it's hospitality trade, right across the country, construction, and that's only going to continue to get worse, because before we talked around about skill shortages and so on. Now we're actually facing labour shortages. And I think the more and more we get into this, then I think the more and more we'll see just how an impact that's going to have in Scotland. And we talk around about making our own decisions for our own country, for our own benefits. Scotland would never have gone down this route, and we are now having to suffer the benefits of a decision that was made down south by a government that doesn't have Scotland's interests at heart at all.
Thanks, Paul. One other thing, we'll be talking more about party political conferences that are running this weekend. We'll be talking more about them later on in the programme. However, at this point, I'm reminded that the SNP conference has passed a resolution which rejects the UK government's regressive nationality and borders bill, which would strip many refugees of crucial rights, including the opportunity to settle in the UK permanently, to family reunion and to access public funds. Anne McLennan MP, who's the SNP's immigration spokesperson, said the SNP has been calling on the UK government to bring in a fair and humane migration system for years, but in light of the situation in Afghanistan, it is now more urgent than ever. By voting through this regressive bill, the Tories have shown they have zero compassion and are refusing to play their part on the global stage in supporting refugees. There has been widespread concern from MPs and charities about this bill, but the Tory government has ploughed ahead with legislation that breaches the UK's international obligations. This regressive bill is a full frontal assault on the Refugee Convention. Scotland has shown it wants to go down a different route. We want to be an open and welcoming country and to play our part on the world stage. So, Paul, reflecting on the conference resolution that's been passed, more generally in terms of migration and refugee status, and Scotland's place in an independent Scotland's place in the world, do you think that this difference of approach between Holyrood and Westminster, do you think that will play well? Do you think that is something that the Scottish electorate is going to will be able to get behind?
Yeah, I think very much so, and it does come back. It's a tale of two governments. The choice that the UK government have made, we have to go along with, and we suffer the consequences. And I mentioned in terms of employment and around about that, but in terms of how the UK is seen and how Scotland is seen, it is a tale of two governments. And I'm glad we've passed the motion, and I think Scotland, I suppose the last time it came, the Syrian refugees took its fair share and took more proportionate share than the UK government did. And in my own local authority, I'm still a councillor. We're preparing plans to welcome Afghan refugees, and I look forward to doing that and visiting some of them when they get across here, and as the MSP as well. So it does, and how well we treat people who are in that position. Nobody wants to be a refugee. Nobody wants to be in that position. They don't want to leave their homeland for that. They don't. Nobody wants to be in that position. So we have to welcome them. We have to show what kind of country Scotland is and play our part in the world. We can't do that at the moment. Our hands are tied. We can't do it at the moment because we don't have the ability to do that. And again, the quicker we move to independence, the more compassionate we can show how Scotland is to the world wide and to people in the rest of the UK, and hopefully set an example there as well.
Thanks, Paul. And Linda, one last thought. How do you think Scottish voters and Scottish people react to the kind of hypocrisy that we're seeing from the right-wing media and right-wing politicians in England?
Do you know what? One of the things that worries me, Andrew, is I think people have stopped even registering it, because I think there's just been so much of this stuff piled on us over the years, and latterly even more so, that people have stopped registering it and don't realise just how bad these people have become. And I'm guilty of it myself sometimes. I don't look at the Express, I don't look at the Daily Mail, because I know that I'm not going to like what I see. And then every so often, you wander in somewhere and there's one line, usually when I'm waiting for a Chinese or an Indian carryout or something in the shop. And, you flick through it, and I flick through it and I go, oh my Lord, it's just got worse and worse and worse. And I think people have stopped registering just how bad they are. I mean, I've had a go at friends that buy the Daily Mail, for example, and say, what are you buying that for? And they're like, oh no, I never read the news, but I like the women's pages, or I like the puzzle pages, or this or that. So that's my concern, is that people are now saying, oh, there's no point in listening to them. And they just keep getting away with more and more and putting it under the radar because folk aren't registering. So that's a concern that I have. And, I would really like to see an awful lot of that stuff called out more for what it is. It's nasty, it's vindictive, it's horrible, and unfortunately it is being stirred up by some elected politicians. And how far that goes is a concern for me.
Thanks, Linda. We'll move on now to the next story we'll talk about, and on Tuesday we learned in detail the all about the Scottish Government's programme for government for this coming year. The programme for government, of course, covers a wide range of areas and topics. However, regarding health and social care, this programme for government included the following commitments: increasing frontline health spending by 20%, leading to an increase of at least £2.5 billion by 2026-27. Undertaking the biggest public service reform since the founding of the NHS with the creation of a national care service. Improving national well-being with an increased direct mental health investment of at least 25%, with £120 million this year to support the recovery and transformation of services, and investing £250 million to tackle the drugs death emergency over the next 5 years. Now, Paul, you've already touched on the tale of two governments. In Scotland this week, the discussion has been about the programme for government and, in particular, the health and social care elements of it, in particular the proposals to create a national care service. Whereas in another place, in another country, the conversation seems to all have been about tax and spend and about the poor subsidising the wealthy, and not much of a sign of a concrete plan in terms of health and social care, making improvements to health and social care in that place. So Paul, firstly, what are your reactions to this element of the programme for government, and what do you think it tells us about the priorities of the Scottish Government?
Yeah, Andrew, I think obviously I actually spoke on this point on Tuesday in particularly around about the health elements of it and investment, I think, to the additional spend over the course of the Parliament, which I think is incredibly important. And I think I mentioned before, we had a briefing from NHS Lothian just on Friday, and one of the things we were talking about was mental health provision. And the additional funding is starting to be planned and starting to be already talked about how that's going to be used, and and that will clear backlogs. So, and I've been meeting quite often with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and obviously one of the big issues is mental health. So they very warmly welcome that, and I'm hoping to get a members' debate on that in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and been working with colleagues on that. So I think that's welcome. I know in one constituency we have the East Lothian Community Hospital, and again, investment into that area I think would be fantastic. With additional 10% in new services. So I think that's very welcome. And I think obviously we started this discussion and debate a number of years ago with integrated joint boards. It's not been without its teething problems, but I still think there's opportunities, to work closer together. And I know the Accounts Commission, for example, will be reporting back in that. And I'm also on the local government committee at the Parliament, which we're looking into obviously the National Care Service. So that's going to be a big element in the work for that committee. But I think we've made steps. I think we've recognised that over the last number of years with integration things have improved. There's still much to be done, and I think obviously that's where Scottish Government's looking at National Care Service to try and look at how we prioritise that, how we standardise conditions, and obviously deal with issues such as recruitment, which we talked about earlier before. So I welcome it. The plans for the UK government, I think first of all, they talked about the national insurance hike and the way they've structured that. It's going to affect the poorest in society, and then on the back of that, obviously we see the removal of the triple lock. So again, that's going to damage. It's not related. Pensioners are going to be hit proportionally harder than most other areas. And again, that's a choice that the UK government's made. I don't think the Scottish government would.
Thanks, Paul. That's a very good point. Linda, thinking about that element of the way in which the Westminster plan is to be funded, and also putting it into the context, also as we know of the UK having one of the worst state pensions in northwestern Europe, in Western Europe. What do you think that the way in which the Prime Minister's plan is to be funded, set against the backdrop of apparent disregard at a UK level of the rights and the requirements of our more senior citizens and of older people? What do you think that tells us about the priorities we see from Westminster?
Yeah. Well, Paul's right in what he said about those with the least getting hit the hardest by the national insurance hike. I mean, that's no surprise from a Conservative government, especially the type of Conservative government that Boris Johnson is heading up. I mean, I would have preferred to have seen income tax hikes on higher earners, and then there's a whole issue of tax avoidance, all of that coming in. Basically the UK tax system is not fair. And it's regressive. But there's another element to it as well. That cap that they've put on how much of your capital will go into paying for your own care. Now, that's directly aiming at those that Boris Johnson thinks he gets their support from. When you look at the value of property and land, etc., down particularly in the southeast of England, there's a lot of people are going to benefit from this policy that he's put in place in relation to the cap. So he's playing to his own support as he sees it. It's playing to those who are quite comfortable. It's the same when they look at not increasing inheritance tax and all these things. He's always got an eye, they always have an eye to those that they represent. And that's what we're up against. And they just don't really give a toss about anybody else. So that's the bottom line. And that is proved, when you look at taking away the £20 universal credit as well. Again, hitting those with the least the hardest. So I think we just have to accept that they play to their own, and that's what they're doing. An ongoing frustration, of course, being that the Scottish Government have to use their funds in mitigation of the excesses of that, as opposed to being able to do all the things that we would like to do. And I actually think the Scottish Government does rather well. In relation to the care service, I mean, again, Paul's right, and this was started in Scotland a long, long time ago. And to be non-partisan, it was actually started by Henry McLeish and the Labour Lib Dem coalition when they brought in free personal care, against the wishes of Westminster at the time. I mean, it was a Labour government down there at the time, and it was still against their wishes. And in fact, I can't remember the figures, but Scotland was penalised for that policy having come in by losing attendance allowance income. So we've always been a bit up against it in terms of how we want to do things up here and how they're actually done down there. So tailor to governments, you know, again, as Paul said, and we just have to get on and do what's best for Scotland under the limited circumstances that we have.
Thank you, Linda. Now we'll move on. We've been talking a little bit about already about the events unfolding at party political conferences over this weekend. Conferences taking place both virtually and in person as the pandemic progresses, and political parties and movements continue to evolve and respond to the challenges that the ongoing pandemic presents to our usual political lives. But in terms of the SNP national conference that's taking place this weekend, the SNP's president, Mike Russell, has told the conference that independence must become Scotland's new normal. He told delegates that while the pandemic had put life on hold for many people, and it inevitably meant that building towards another independence referendum had to pause, the people of Scotland must decide as a matter of urgency how our country should build forward from the pandemic and create a new, greener, more equal, more fair and more accessible society. He said to the conference that we must also begin to prepare ourselves again for that most normal, the most essential of steps, seeking the approval of the Scottish people to rejoin the world as an independent nation, making our own decisions about how to build forward to a better future. In the European Union, almost half the member states are the same size as Scotland or smaller, some much smaller. They are also states that pay better pensions, have higher incomes, work more productively, are happier and healthier, and play an effective role in the world, like our neighbour, independent Ireland, which this month chairs the UN Security Council. Those benefits of independence are not accidental. They are as a result of being able to make their own decisions and work constructively on the basis of equality with others. So, Paul, turning to you, what's your reaction to Mike Russell's address to the conference yesterday and the passing of a resolution, I think, in support of a draft referendum bill?
Yeah, it's very welcome, and I have to say, you know, Mike Russell, since he's came into post, you know, since he retired from the Parliament, has made a massive impact, I think, in moving the cause forward and the case forward. So I think it's very welcome, and I think the other thing that he also mentioned as well was also talking around about looking at issues around about transition, and I think, you know, that's one of the key things, because sometimes the question you get asked is how do we move from where we are just now to being an independent country, and I think, you know, the more we talk about transitioning from being a devolved nation to being an independent nation, I think is vitally important. And I think it is backed up by the Scottish people. You know, I think that the Times tried to report this morning that only 17% of people wanted a referendum within 2 years. But what they didn't fail to say, there was another 36% wanted it within the next 2 to 5 years, which falls within the first half of the parliamentary term. So 53% want an independence referendum in this parliamentary term. And, you know, I think politically that will go down well. I think it will be supported in the Parliament. And I certainly look forward to going out and discussing and debating with people in my constituency and all across Scotland about the benefits of independence and just being a normal nation. You know, and I watched this morning Kate Forbes, you know, talking about the economy, and she talked about Denmark and Norway, similar countries to ourselves, but we have GDP of 30 to 40% higher than Scotland, because they have the economic levers to ensure that they've got economic success. That's what lies ahead for Scotland. There are opportunities around about that to become successful as Norway, Denmark, and other small independent countries that we know prosper. within the EU and also other countries also without that. But there are massive opportunities for Scotland, and we just have to look across the waters, as I said, at Denmark and Norway to see what opportunities lie ahead for us.
Thanks, Paul. Now, Linda, I don't think you've been attending conference, so I will not ask you to reflect on detail of a meeting that you've not been present at. But when Mike Russell talks about in the European Union, and as Paul has been talking as well, the states that pay better pensions, have higher incomes, work more productively, are happier and healthier, and play an effective role in the world, such as chairing the UN Security Council, as Ireland is chairing at the moment. Do you think, bearing in mind, as Paul was saying as well, in terms of polling that we've seen this week, 47% of people are not persuaded yet of the benefits of independence that Mike Russell was describing yesterday. Do you think, is it people that simply don't believe that that other countries are able to do so much better and to achieve so much more when they have the levers of power? Do voters just not believe it, or do they not believe that they can be part of a country that does achieve those things?
Oh, I think there's all sorts of issues there. Fear of change is a very strong issue. People just don't like change. I mean, that is a worrying thing. But Andrew touched on something as well. Oh, sorry, it wasn't. It was Paul. Paul touched on something as well, Andrew, that I think is really important when he mentioned the Times article, and what I believe to be a misleading headline. It's a headline with an agenda. Pick out a statistic and use that and make that look as if it's the main part of the study that's been carried out when it quite clearly isn't. And that's something else that we have to watch for. I think you said that Michael Russell said we have to prepare for da 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 da. Right. But what we also have to prepare for is the onslaught of misinformation that's going to come down the line, because the establishment will get together as they did before. But I think worse this time because they're more scared this time. They will get together, and boy, oh boy, will they pile it on. Now, yesterday, I put out a completely innocuous wee tweet, just saying why I think we should be independent. And aside from the insults, the vitriol, the bitterness, the absolute madness that came flying down the line at me, there were also people who came in and said, but we can't be independent because. And they were quoting things that just aren't true, but that have been picked up by the popular press, fed by that establishment that I'm talking about. And it is misuse of figures. We now know that they're willing to be absolutely blatant. Look at the lies that were told over the Brexit referendum. Out and out lies. They got away with it. So it's going to be even worse than it was last time. But the good news is, when you talk about, 47% according to this latest survey that are not quite persuaded, look where we were at pre 2014. Things were a lot worse, and boy, oh boy, did we do well in that regard to get to where we got to. We had a situation where it was, even the day before, they were putting out the nonsense. That was the vow and all the rest of it that was completely meaningless and never came to pass at all. So the good news is that we're in a stronger position than we were in before. The worrying news is that the onslaught's going to be even worse and will probably start earlier. In fact, it started already. I mean, under the guise of UK government work, they're already doing things to try and weaken the confidence of the Scottish people. And I find it really difficult, not just that people don't look to the Scandinavian countries to see how we can be when we have more resources, but Ireland, my goodness, smaller than us, far fewer resources, but what they do have is the right to make their own decisions and thus have become very successful. And it's in making your own decisions that is so important.
Thanks, Linda. And Paul, thinking of some of those points that Linda was making, where do you think we are in terms of either the preparation for the preparation, or in terms of the setting up, the bringing into action of the tools and the resources and the processes and the approaches and the people that will be required both to to make a positive case for independence, and also to respond to make a positive case for independence, to begin to frame and set the agenda, and also to be able to respond to the onslaught as Linda was describing it.
I think, when we look at the election result in May, I think that, we all know there's a mandate out there for that. And I think, again, it was another mandate to go out and proceed with the plans for an independence referendum. We have that majority in Parliament, and that, there will be a bill passed. Whatever that happens in terms of discussions with Boris Johnson, then we'll wait and see. But I think the UK government know that there's change coming. We just had to look at the headline in the Financial Times last week, talking around about plans to move China. They know that they can't say no all the time. They know they're going to have to face an independence referendum at some stage, and I think they know what the travel direction is in that regard. I think, as I said, since Mike Russell took post and after the election, and with that fresh mandate, I think we are talking about transition. We are talking about what independence is actually going to look like, and that's maybe a lesson from last time is, what's the transition? I think that's really important. Is what would the transition look like in doing that? And I think we've got, for my opinion, I think we've got two or three main advantages we've got now. People have seen the lies last time. They've seen the lies of Brexit, and they're not going. I don't think people are going to see as much through that. I think Linda's right to a certain regard in terms of the establishment. Will push lies through and do whatever they want. I think the demographics of Scotland are very strong in terms of moving towards independence. The poll out last week talked around about people under 55, for example, and I think it's up around about 60%. Under 18 to 24 is up around about 75%. So the demographics within Scotland is moving towards, strong support for an independent Scotland. So I think we're in a good position. And as Linda said, I think the last time we started our support was on 27%. And I think, the vow, the couple of polls before the vow came out, we were just, over 50%. And, again, that was another set of lies that came through. I think we're in a strong position. I'm very confident we would win the referendum, but we have to be prepared for the onslaught, as Linda said, that the British establishment will throw at us, because they will throw a lot at us. We have to be ready. And I think one of the key things is, there'll be discussions around about in Twitter and in the papers and so on. Where we're going to win it is on the doorsteps and actually speaking to people. And that's I've never been so convinced of that than we are now. And I'm sure once that time arrives, we will go out, we will debate it, we will say to people, here are the opportunities that lie ahead for Scotland, and we will move towards being an independent country.
Thanks, Paul. And we'll continue to touch on that a little bit, especially in the context of the party conferences that are taking place this weekend, because as I mentioned briefly, a motion on the Scottish Government's draft referendum bill was backed by delegates at the SNP conference. The motion welcomed the draft bill that had been published before the election in May, and the manifesto commitment to hold a referendum for recovery once it was safe to do so, and to conduct a detailed and serious national debate on independence. The Cabinet Secretary for Constitution and External Affairs, Angus Robertson, said there is a cast-iron democratic mandate for an independence referendum, with the SNP receiving the highest share of the vote and the strongest electoral endorsement in the history of devolution in May's election. He said that he was delighted that conference had now backed the motion to pass the draft referendum bill and to ensure that Scotland's future will be put into Scotland's hands with a referendum for recovery. He said that we are already seeing plans for Tory cuts as they slash universal credit and plans to hike up national insurance, taking those that need it most. Scotland cannot afford another decade of Tory austerity. We have already seen the devastating impact cuts can have on the most vulnerable in society as the Tories build their vision of recovery on the backs of the poorest in society. We cannot trust the Tories to protect the future of Scotland. That is why it is so important that Scotland has the choice to forge a different, better path with independence. And so, Paul, do you feel that the SNP as a party and as the two parliamentary groups are beginning to are we beginning to see now a coming into focus, a sharpening, an increase in the strength of the purpose and the bite, if that's the right word, in terms of policy and in terms of preparation? I'm thinking of sections of the independence community who have been sceptical about the appetite and sceptical about the preparations and have been vocal about that. Do you feel that this conference motion that was backed yesterday. Does this represent the beginning of a change of gear, perhaps, for the Scottish Government?
Yeah, very much so. And I think obviously when you've seen, obviously we talked about the mandate, and I agree with Mike. There was a cast iron mandate there before. It was strengthened in the election in May, and I think obviously we've seen the programme for government where the First Minister talked around about holding the referendum bill, but also talked around about instructing civil servants to start preparing the case. Again, which I think is vitally important. And we have to be in a position, and let's face it, we have to win this time. We can't lose again. If we lose it again, it's going to be extremely difficult to have a third referendum and go ahead and try and win that one. So I think we need to be in a position, and the First Minister touched on this morning in an interview, saying she was asked around about the timing of a referendum. And of course, elections and referendums are held when people think they can win it, and we need to be as sure as we are in that regard. So I think for what the First Minister's mentioned around about talking to the civil service, talking about it being in the programme of government, and also we heard from Mike Russell talking about obviously transitioning the parties strengthening up, and I know the Greens are very strong in terms of that, and I really welcome the cooperation agreement between the SNP, the Scottish Government, and the Greens, and I think they recognise that as well. And we just talked about this morning about some of the things we talked, foreign policy, universal credits, immigration policy, and climate change and so on, things that we don't have any influence in at all that we would have as an independent country. So I certainly feel there's a step up in gears, and I certainly think over the next few years I'm really looking forward to taking that debate within the Parliament, out with the Parliament, and securing what every other nation wants, a normal independent country.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. And Linda, you've taken a step back in a sense from frontline. You've taken a well-earned step back in some senses from frontline politics. But what's your reflection? Do you feel that this conference motion that was passed and that some of the other steps that have been outlined by the First Minister, do you think they represent a sharpening up, a toughening up, perhaps and to mix the metaphors horribly, perhaps the beginning of a shift in gear by the Scottish Government towards an independence referendum?
I think it's always been there. I think it's just more public now. I mean, I'm just not in any doubt that anyone in the SNP, particularly those who are in a position of leadership, I'm just never in any doubt that independence is first and foremost in their minds. It has ever been thus. So that has been going on. And, what Paul said is really, really important. You don't just rush into these things. You have to win it. If you believe passionately in something, like MD and the SNP does about independence, we were all gutted at the referendum in 2014, absolutely gutted. We have to win this. I mean, when you look at, for example, take Quebec as an example, how it's panned out there. This time, we've got to know exactly what we're doing. We have the added issue of a pandemic. I think folk are underestimating the effect and the work that has been put in on every single aspect of government and of life in relation to COVID-19. The work that's been involved in that is huge. Whether it be local government or national government, it's huge. But always there has been that thought by everyone in the SNP government that independence means that we can help the recovery from COVID and start to forge what we want as a nation. So that work's been ongoing. The work with the Greens has been ongoing as well. It didn't just happen overnight. And now we're at the stage where the leadership feels confident to be able to say, looks like we can have our referendum at this time. And yes, it is a step forward. And yes, things will be seen to be moving more quickly and with more urgency. But that doesn't mean that people have been resting on their laurels up till now in any way whatsoever.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you. And that is your Full Scottish today on Sunday the 12th of September. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, and we would like you to support us, then please consider donating or subscribing to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be back tomorrow at 7 o'clock with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. I should like to say very many thanks to both Paul and to Linda for taking the time to join us this afternoon and for sharing with us their thoughts and their wisdom and their experience. Thank you both.
Thank you, Andrew.
I should also say thank you for joining us at Broadcasting Scotland today. I hope that you have a very peaceful rest of your weekend.